Hello YouTube. I want to talk about how I discovered forensic genealogy. My wife died and she had been a special victim, and she did not make me aware that she was on drugs or how she had come to be on drugs. And she overdosed on my birthday almost 9 years ago now. It'll be 9 years in September of this year. Within a few months, I began doing research on Ancestry to try to get answers. And while I was doing that, trying to figure out where she had come from and what was going on, I had a theory which ended up proving accurate, that it was part of a bigger problem. And through my studies of genealogy records, I figured out from visual examination of public records, the census, and people taking measures to actively corrupt the genealogical records to conceal what was going on, I saw discrepancies. And through the examination of multiple records, looking back and forth for a long time, sometimes 10 to 12 hours a day, for several months, I began to realize what was going on, what people were doing. And I'm not going to name anybody here. But when I became aware of how the database that I was looking at could be used in a law enforcement capacity, I called the FBI tip line and I told them, hey, look, I'm just a layman. I don't know everything about this, but I know enough to know that this is something major that you really need to look at. And this wasn't forensic investigative genetic genealogy that I was working with. I didn't know anything about genomics. I didn't know anything about genetics. And I still have a lot to learn. But I knew enough from cross-examining records, going back and forth between various different types of records, to see that things weren't adding up, that people were taking measures to corrupt the public record so as to conceal what is actively going on present day and what was going on in the past, out of shame and out of guilt. It wasn't my objective to become a special investigator in the course of that work. I don't work with law enforcement, but I have provided them a lot of direction, I'll say that, through information that I've provided, to try to get somebody to pick up this information and do something with it. Because my wife died prematurely in her late 20s, leaving me widowed. And over time I realized that I had been a victim as well. It's a complex story, but I could not get legal assistance, and I ended up experiencing swatting for a long time. And the people responsible tried to weaponize the authorities against me, not realizing that I was already talking to the authorities at length and sharing my discoveries and recollections that I was recovering as I was doing this research. I needed to figure out a way to make money from this work so that I could help others and so that I could take care of my financial obligations to my family. I still haven't gotten to that point yet. A lot of people have started LLCs, and they've gone off and started to do independent genealogy work, building family trees for law enforcement to aid in investigations. But it's hard to work directly with those authorities when you've been subjected so extensively to false reporting and swatting calls. And I haven't really known what to do about that. I've talked to them about it, and I said, look, the reason people were trying to get at me is because they thought that I had informed on them, and I hadn't. I shared what I knew of the situation that I was affected by, where my wife and members of her family had been drugging me, and on a number of occasions I was a victim of sexual assault as I slept, and I ended up with this injury here. You can see a line in the video. That's from me being cut by my wife just 4 years into our marriage while I was asleep after being drugged. And I had no idea that had happened. And that was very traumatic to recall that, to remember that when the memory first came back. And I didn't get legal assistance or any kind of assistance with any of my concerns. So my house ended up going to foreclosure, and I got very sick. And we were a victim of crime on a secondary basis. My household was through burglary and DARVO and false reporting. And I was experiencing a high intensity of authority contact because the people that were involved thought that I had turned full-blown state's evidence. And it took me a while to figure out a lot of the things that were happening. I started to piece things together from situations that had happened where I lacked context for things that I observed, wasn't made aware of situations that were going on where other people were visiting my home while I was asleep, while I was at school, while I was at work, where I'd walk in on a situation not realizing what had just been happening after waking up or after coming home from work. There were suspicious things that happened. There were things that I saw or heard where I lacked the context to place those things in until after I was made aware on her death, a little while after her death, that this situation had been going on where she had been getting abused. And then, of course, when I was questioned, I reported it to law enforcement because I wanted to stop the people that were responsible for that. Some of them were still alive, and they had known for the duration, since long before I met her, that those circumstances were going on. But I did not get the protections that I expected for functioning as an informant about forensic genealogy, and it ended up being a big mess that caused me major financial damage and material losses. And I couldn't get any help with any of my concerns, with any of my legal concerns or otherwise, even as I reached out to people and spoke to them, people who were supposed to deal with those situations. And when my house was burglarized on multiple occasions after all that stuff happened, it aggravated circumstances because I already felt unsafe in the home that I was living in because of what she had done and because of the false reporting and the swatting calls we were experiencing. But it just made it much worse having to deal with actual property damage and loss of use. And we had dealt with a major disaster just a couple of years prior to that the insurance didn't cover. And my lender placed my house in foreclosure, and I didn't know what to do about that either. So as all this was going on, I couldn't get any outside financial support, And my spouse had been our provider, and I ended up on survivor's benefits. But I've had special offenders ruin my life many times, and this wasn't the first time with her. There have been other people in my life, unfortunately, in the distant past, on multiple occasions, who caused me losses or didn't meet my basic needs, didn't keep me safe from criminal offenders when I was a dependent person. And I could not explain to authorities what had been happening with those circumstances, because I didn't understand what was going on. It's hard to understand something where you don't have the words, or the terminology, or the context. And law enforcement did not protect me at any juncture, from the beginning, from the first situation to the last. Instead, it was often the case that people who were guilty would use Darvo against me to attack me as a victim of crime, as a survivor of those situations. And all I did throughout most of my life was read books, and largely kept it to myself, and made good grades in school. But I didn't get credit for forensic genealogy, and I have had to endure character-based attacks where people have disseminated false information about me in order to damage my reputation and to shift scrutiny from themselves as guilty people to me as an innocent person. Throughout my life. When I'm talking about throughout my life, I'm saying over the span of at least 32 years, on and off intermittently. So you can understand that these situations have been going on a long time, and the authorities aren't good about proving these things, and they're not good about protecting victims or giving them the support that they need, even when the people who are affected are minor children, as I was. And then later on, I was affected again as an adult. And that left me in really dire straits. I didn't have the money from my existing employment at the job that I worked at for insurance benefits to mitigate any challenge that came my way, because the company wasn't compensating me fairly. I would leave my job prior to getting into the forensic work that I was doing after she died. Unpaid work, that is, unpaid research. On a good week, I was making between $150 and $250 a week, which is nothing, and everybody knows you can't live on that. You can't even cover most of your basic expenses on that kind of income. And I was a homemaker outside of my job. I took care of a lot of things. Everything that my spouse couldn't do, I did. I picked up all the slack, all the responsibility. And my spouse sunk deeper and deeper into addiction as she continued to have affairs with her abuser, somebody that was close to her. You can probably imagine what I'm talking about. And I had no idea that was happening. I didn't even know why she was sick. And she was sick all the time. We had perhaps 500 doctor's visits that she had to go to in roughly 9 years that we were together because of chronic respiratory infection. And that stemmed from her being abused sexually using ether, diethyl ether. I hadn't even heard of that. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what huffing inhalation abuse was, or forced drugging. So I got a very quick introduction to what had happened to me through research, once I figured out exactly what had been going on and how these attacks were being facilitated. And I wanted to prove, using external databases, that these behaviors were occurring within the groups that were engaging in those types of activities. And that is why I got into doing genealogy work. But I didn't know who to go to for funding, and I also had another concern. And it may seem like I'm meandering here, but I'm getting to a point. The reason I didn't go straight to law enforcement with it was because I strongly believed that with the prevalence of these behaviors and the sheer number of offenders out there, that there had to be some degree of complicity from within law enforcement. Through my research, that's exactly what I figured out was going on. The very first person that they identified as an offender on a national basis was a California highway patrolman. And y'all know him to be the Golden State Killer. I was worried that there were others out there within law enforcement actively serving at the time that I made this discovery. And I did not want to be targeted by those persons, or potentially hurt, or have somebody in my family be hurt by them if somebody realized that there was a party out there that had gotten hip to what was going on and had a way to prove what was happening. Making a discovery like this is extremely dangerous. It's terribly dangerous because you just don't know who may be in your midst when you're dealing with the authorities, whether it's law enforcement or another government investigative agency, that might be implicated criminally by those databases that you're working with. And this is what I told the authorities that I communicated with remotely. I said, look, I don't know exactly what you're going to find, but there's a lot. There's a lot of information here. I suspect a large number of people are implicated criminally. And I'm not sure what to do about this. I don't have the resources to deal with this problem. And it's dangerous as a person without qualified immunity to be doing that sort of research without, very significant financial backing and protections. A lot of people don't realize that when you start having to file reports, if you end up being a victim, if anybody you know is a victim, they have to file reports. A lot of them are going to experience retaliatory reporting. And even though there's nothing to find, being contacted, multiple times or several dozen times by authorities who are seeking to discredit things that you're not even aware have been said about you, false statements, etc. False accusations get to the point where they're traumatic after a while, and you end up with health challenges because of false accusations. It can be very damaging to an individual, and the authorities understand that. They know that. A lot of the time, when somebody is telling a long story, it ends up being the case that you have to give that person a protective order to prevent them from experiencing further retaliation. And I did not have such an order in place. But that is how I discovered forensic genealogy, and it started out with Ancestry.com. I didn't take credit back in 2018 before they identified the Golden State Killer, because I was afraid of criminal violence or retaliation by people who thought that they had been found out potentially. And I did experience extensive retaliation from those that I did inform on in the situation that I was dealing with. I never got legal assistance. And there have been arrests unrelated to my wife's situation before. There are other criminals that we encountered on a secondary basis who have been arrested and charged with felonies. And I wish that their process of investigation and dealing with these situations was more effective, that it was faster. But it takes them time to gather information on things like organized crime and drug trafficking, whoever the agency is that you're dealing with. But maybe one day I'll be able to make a career out of forensic genealogy, but for now I don't have a bachelor's degree, and I haven't been to any genealogical programs. I was simply a self-taught person that placed a whole lot of time on visual examination of the records to make the discoveries that I did. I didn't know how to trace relatives to cold cases using forensic investigative genetic genealogy. I didn't know how to do that. That wasn't the aspect that I discovered. What I was looking at was strictly visual comparisons between records. Thanks for watching.